Mark, I'll tell you how to machine up a crankshaft now. Alright, so the crankshaft is a 6-inch crank throw, and we've got about an inch either side of the crank pin that houses the connecting rod and acts as a bearing. So that's say 7 inches times 2 is 14 inches times 3 to make a circle is 42 inches, and that's the outside circumference of your billet of steel to cast your crankshaft with a 6-inch throw. Alright, so what you do, since the firing order is 153624, and it's a 6-cylinder, and there's always 2 cylinders together, so 1 and 6 are together, and then you turn the crankshaft clockwise 120 degrees, and then you go from the center line of 1 and 6 big end bearing crank pin to the center line of the number 2 and 5 big end bearing crank pin center line. That's 120 degrees. Then you turn the crankshaft clockwise 120 degrees, and then you place the 3 and 4 center line of the big end bearing crank pins on number 3 and 4 cylinder 120 degrees from the number 2 and 5 center line crank pins. So obviously, since you turn the crankshaft clockwise 120 degrees, and then the next ones come up and you do them, and then you turn the crankshaft 120 degrees again, you do the next one, and then it's finished. So there you go, it's simple. But what you got to do when you're doing the counterweights, you've got to include the weight of the connecting rod. All right, both sides of the connecting rod, only to the highest point on the crankshaft where the crank pin is. All right, so you got the crank pin, big end bearing pin, crank pin, the connecting rod goes on, and you got the bit sticking up either side, which act as a bearing on the crankshaft. You got to include the whole round bit of crankshaft there. The whole round bit of connecting rod, bearing and all. So you don't use the actual lineal part of the connecting rod, because that just rotates at a bit of an angle, 180 degree angle. But what you use is actually the bit that wraps, the bit of the connecting rod that wraps around the big end bearing crank pin, because the connecting rod is actually just moving in and out at an angle, but you got to include the bit of the connecting rod that wraps around the actual crankshaft and does a 360 degree rotation with the crankshaft, because the actual connecting rod sort of does but doesn't, the lineal part of it, but it just goes like that. It sort of doesn't. You just got to include the bit that wraps around the big end bearing crank pin, that part of the connecting rod, both the bearing cap and the just level with the either side of the where the crank pin is, which acts as a bearing on the connecting rod, and that'll balance the crank perfectly. So what you got to do is you got to add that weight to the counterweights, and that's what you're missing. That's why big end bearings will work on loose, because they'll catch out of balance. So there you go. So there you go, mate. I won't wreck it anyway.